The first day I encountered law school, I first appreciated Section 6 of the Penal Code Act of Uganda, which was saying, ignorance of the law is not a defense. So, I came up and said, before these citizens of Uganda can become victims of such a circumstance, we need to appreciate the basic concepts in law. And then today, I'm going to take us through the doctrine of separation of powers. When we said doctrine of the doctrine of separation of powers, we mainly talk about the instance where each arm of the government is separate and operating differently from the other arms of the government. So Montesquieu talked about the doctrine of separation of powers in his book, The Spirit of the Law. So, according to Montesquieu, the doctrine meant three main things. Number one, he meant that each arm of the government should be run by different people, and therefore no one person should belong to more than one arm of the government. And secondly, he said, each arm of the government should be independent of the other in decision making, such that when an arm of the government makes its decision, none of the other two arms of the government should interfere with such a decision. And thirdly, he meant that no one arm of the government should take over the powers of the other. So, it has come to attention that the pure doctrine of separation of powers as per Montesquieu is really unrealistic. And therefore, we adopted a new principle which we call the principle of checks and balances, which is basically a principle that calls for interdependence among these three arms of the government. And when we talk about the principle of checks and balances, we mean that each arm of the government should rely on the other, and an arm of government can come up and influence if at all the other arm goes beyond what it is supposed to do in accordance with the law. And this was seen by Justice Kanye Hamba in the case of Major General David Nyefunza, where he mentioned that the principle of non-interference must prevail except in circumstances where the other arms of the government, that is the executive and the legislature, go beyond what they are supposed to do. That's when the judiciary can come in and then try to correct the excesses. So, basically the principle of checks and balances is a principle that has replaced the former one, which is the pure doctrine of separation of powers. So the clause related to this is the independence of the judiciary, which we see under Article 128 of the Ugandan Constitution. And basically, this independence of the judiciary mainly says the judiciary should be independent in the decisions it is making, and therefore, when the judiciary makes its decisions, the other two arms of the government, that is say the executive and the legislature, should uphold the decisions made by the judiciary. But on a number of occasions, we have seen that the judiciary has been interfered with in executing its duties. So, it is also important to note that under Article 128, starting with Clause 1 to Clause 8, there are the 8 pillars which show the independence of the judiciary. And those 8 pillars must be respected, and removing one of them would affect the independence of the judiciary, as Finamujuni noted in Masalum Sen versus the Attorney General. So it is important to note that is the doctrine of separation of powers, checks and balances, and the independence of the judiciary. So for more information, you can always contact, and we shall always interact with you. Basically, make reference to those cases. Read the case of Uganda Law Society versus the Attorney General, that is talking about the principle of checks and balances. Look at the case of Major General David Nyefunza versus the Attorney General, that will talk about the pure separation of powers. Then for the independence of the judiciary, you also look at the case of Masalum Musen and 3 others versus the Attorney General. So basically, that is the principle of checks and balances and independence of the judiciary, and then the separation of powers as per Montesquieu. So thank you very much. Always follow, subscribe, and like whatever you see. We shall always keep in touch.